Origin Chess, Abrams-X, and this is why the Russian Army T-72 tank is worse than you think. But I'm asking purpose. Yeah, another T series tank. Alright. Also the T-90 video from one of the channels. I forgot the name. Yeah. This is about T-72. Is this better or worse? Numbering doesn't make sense to me. It's like T-14, now T-90, T-72. Is this better than T-90 or worse than T-90? I don't know. But yeah. Another Russian tank that is supposedly worse. How the fuck a country has so many tanks, and which is, like one of the biggest strength is tank, or was before the war, I don't know. And it's like the tank sucks, right? So I don't know. It's gonna be interesting. Let's watch it. This was on Task and Purpose. Great channel I found about the stuff like this. Covers a lot of topics that you can probably think of, which is like interesting. So yeah. Does it have a like B21 video? Apparently the one that they are going to replace B2 or something. But yeah. Remember, flag don't forget to subscribe. That way you can help this channel by helping the algorithm. If you haven't seen my other reactions to stuff like this, check out the link in the description or in the end of the video and the card or something. And yeah, let's watch it.
How's it going, Spare Parts Army? I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy. So we've seen Russia's most prolific tank, the T-72, get absolutely destroyed.
Most prolific.
And a lot of people are starting to wonder, what the heck went wrong with this tank? Is it a hardware problem, or was it simply human error? Human error was actually my nickname growing up. In this video, we're going to examine why the Russian armored philosophy hasn't really worked on the modern battlefield, and what they could have done to fix it in hindsight. Autoload a shell into your smoothbore cannon, fire off around at that like and subscribe button if you enjoy this video, and let's move out, hooah! When I'm researching these videos, I run into one problem all the time, where I need to verify and vet each news source to know how it's biased in one direction or another, so I can interpret the information correctly.
Oh, I need to skip this. YouTube interpret news as problematic. Yeah, we'll go to ground.news/task and support this channel.
Description to download the free app. I think it's safe to say that the backbone of the Russian army and their entire doctrine revolves around its tanks, and the most commonly used one is the T-72. So to give the devil his due here, this tank is very fast moving, it's lightweight, and its 125mm cannon gives it incredible firepower. Above all else, this tank is incredibly dirt cheap to produce at only $500,000 compared to the US Abrams $8 million price tag. The T-72 development story, it's really emblematic of the Soviet Union's politics that are marred in petty infighting and egregious corruption. The tracked armored vehicle perfectly fits into the Russian military's doctrine of throwing a ton of armored vehicles.
Okay, is this equivalent to Abrams? I'm pretty sure they're like different versions of tanks, right? Heavy tank, light tank. Is this like similar category? If that's the case, why the fuck Abrams cost that much and this is just like $500,000, right? I mean, look, capitalism can be sometimes greedy, and company might overcharge based on which country it is. US is rich, so that might happen, but it can't be that much. So it must mean like Abrams have something that this doesn't even come close to having, but it's probably not in the same category.
At the enemy to try to overwhelm them. A strategy that might have been good 50 years ago, but is coming into question today. There are more than 3 times the amount of T-72 tanks than there are US Abrams in the world. The T-72's performance on the battlefield appears to be lackluster at best. It could be operator error, it could be poor training, it could be outdated design.
Personally, I think the answer can be discovered if we go back and we look at the old Soviet military doctrine. From the US Army's official field manual on the Soviet operations and tactics, it says when confronting an enemy that has taken up defensive positions, the Soviets attempt to strike weak points in the defense and drive to the enemy's rear whenever possible by bypassing his major force concentrations. They would strive to develop penetrations leading to the enemy's rear to topple the enemy defensive structure. Tank armies may be placed in the first echelon for attaining greater speed when terrain and other conditions permit this employment. My analysis of this information is that this strategy worked well in the 80s, but now with this 3rd generation anti-tank systems, it no longer holds up.
So let's take a look at the origins of this vehicle in order to find some clues into the past. The beginnings of the T-72 is a development story that is closely tied in.
All right. What I gather from that is that thing is they try to flank a tank as much as you can, so have like higher agility and things like that, speed or something. So that worked out then. Nowadays with anti-tank weapons, it's not gonna work out. Is that what the point is? Did I miss that shit completely? I don't know.
interwoven with the very start of Russian tank manufacturing. Since the early days of the Soviet Union, their military has always relied on the fundamentals of simplicity in design and ease of manufacture. It's the core to their engineering philosophy, and it's out of necessity, right? Because when you need to create equipment for millions of troops, you have to do it on the cheap and on the fast. The pros of having these cheap equipment in large numbers really outweighed the cons. The T-72 didn't simply fall out of the sky one day out of the blue. It's based on the predecessor, the T-62 design, which is a line of tanks that evolved over time since World War II. The T-62, created in 1961, was originally made for its increased armor-piercing capability. It was the first to be capable of firing the armor-piercing, fin-stabilized, discarding sabot round. And this new ammo type and cannon had one job and one job only: penetrate that enemy NATO tank armor, and it did it well. But the T-62 had some problems. Its main gun wasn't big enough, so they needed to upgrade to the T-64, which solved as many problems as it created. It was a small tank that had a bunch of mechanical problems with its transmission and its engine and its autoloader. It was an absolute nightmare of a tank. So they began working on the tank that would eventually become the T-72.
Two rival tank teams would end up competing against one another.
Yeah, I don't understand this Soviet Union's things. They constantly had problems with making shit, but they still went with the autoloader. And I understand like future stuff is going towards autoloaders. Why wouldn't it be? But if you have like all these other problems, like why not use the simple human loader? What's the problem? Even your enemy is using that. It was always there. It's very easy. It depends on a human. What's the problem? Why insist on giving it autoloader when you have all the other problems?
To create the T-72. One team was headed up by Morozov. He was a very famous, legendary tank designer in the Soviet Union who had the backing of the entire government. On the other hand, there was Kartsev, who was younger. He was this enlisted guy who fought in World War II in the trenches. He really had an uphill battle. He was going to have to convince all of the influential people in the Soviet government that his design was the best way to go.
There was political friction at the Russian tank plant Abrams-X, where the changing of the leadership there became a really sticky situation. The old director of the company resigned, and the new director in charge really opposed the entire idea of the T-72 tank that Kartsev was working on. He even called it a strategic mistake. This put Kartsev at
Yeah, but communism is wholly based on like not giving one that much power. That's the whole thing, right? So even though the other guy's legendary, whatever, and they might be, more like, okay, he's the guy to make it. They're still gonna keep, focus on that ideology and still gonna give the other guy like chance, right? That's the whole thing of them. So communists killed a lot of like, really brainy people, important people, just because it didn't fall right with their ideology, which is like fucked up in itself. So yeah.
At odds with the most powerful people in the Soviet tank building world. And when you're up against that kind of bureaucracy, things usually don't work out well for you. In 1964,
everybody would suit him with a hoodie.
as Kartsev is trying to build a tank that will beat Morozov's rival tank design, a Soviet official visits Kartsev at his office and warns him that what he's doing is wrong. He accuses Kartsev of scheming and backstabbing by setting up a rival tank option. So he shows off his prototype to the Soviet minister, who is wildly impressed because he sees that Kartsev has solved a lot of the design problems that were plaguing his rival team, Morozov's tank. Kartsev had created an autoloader that worked well, and his engine was more reliable. The Soviet military runs a series of tank tests in front of all the military officials, not just the one who hates Kartsev. At this test, it's plain as day to anyone with eyes that Kartsev's tanks are superior. So he essentially wins and is able to go over the heads of the officials who didn't like him. It was fully adopted in 1973, but Major General Kartsev was dismissed and retired by the state. All of the state prizes and awards for the development of the tank were sent to his opponents instead. It wasn't until after the fall of the Soviet Union that he began to receive some recognition. Three men who worked with Kartsev, they were the ones that spoke out after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Okay, this is confusing. Okay, either I'm like confusing ideology, which I don't think I am. Like, communism whole thing is like power to the people in a way, right? So a whole like making one guy this kind of like even they even dismissed and still gave to the famous guy, right? That's like fascism in a way, isn't it? Like suppressing competition is like fascist thing. Well, but that's the yeah, I'm pretty sure in communism it's like, you're not supposed to, basically you're not supposed to give anybody that much power that he rises above the common folk that much, right? So if anything, that you would think like they would basically support this other guy. Look at China right now, right? Anything that goes out of hand, they suppress it, even if it means like they make less profit or something, which is weird. They suppresses a lot of companies and shit, right? What is that Paris type looking town they made? It just went too much like Western or whatever. So they like I don't know. There was something there, so it's just like a ghost town now. So yeah, that's what communist does. Just like making sure just one guy is the main thing. That's more of a fascist thing, isn't it?
Union, and they confirmed stories of Kartsev and how he worked on the T-72 and what really happened. So what was so special about the T-72 that it made it win out above the petty considerations of politics and corruption? It offered a new, larger 125mm main gun that could penetrate US and NATO heavy armor. It used the same base armor composite instead of the older homogeneous cast steel. The vehicle required a smaller 3-man crew as opposed to the traditional 4-man crew thanks to its reliable autoloader. If the autoloader on the T-72 broke down, you could manually crank it by hand. The tank could carry around 40 rounds of ammunition. It weighed 41 tons, with later models rising to around 44 tons. It used a V12 diesel engine with 780 horsepower, and it could reach a top speed of 47 miles per hour. Full production numbers are estimated at around 25,000 units, not including the older models by other countries, which is estimated to be around 50,000 total units. Well, let's look at a comparison of the T-72 compared to the Abrams. The T-72 is this tiny little thing compared to the massive American tank, as you can see. So why is it that the Soviets decided to design their tank really small like this? In World War II, the Soviets had a lineup of different tanks, including light, medium, and heavy. So the Soviets decided to invest in the light tank philosophy instead, with the T-72, while keeping that larger main gun on it. The lightweight, cheap direction of the T-72 was then closely paired with Soviet tactics. Masses of tanks support advancing infantry.
The biggest advantage here with the T-72 is also kind of its biggest weakness, because this vehicle was designed to be used by a conscript army, so it's supposed to be easy to operate. But it's its biggest weakness because I think what went wrong here is that conscripts cannot pull off sophisticated tank tactics. It's supposed to be easy to maintain, but that's not the case if all of your corrupt generals are stealing the funds that are meant for maintaining the vehicles. I think the main thing that went wrong with the T-72 isn't so much that they stopped improving on the tank, and more so that the Russian army has clearly failed to invest in the expensive and complicated training necessary to pull off combined operations. Forget about coordinating between the Air Force and the Army. I'm talking about
Yeah, as a communist thing, it does make sense. Like make it cheap to easy to maintain, cheap to maintain, make it light so you can flank things. It's just agile. But at that time, you need skill as well. Your conscripts won't have that kind of skill. Yeah. At least one thing is like linear. The communists knew, Soviets knew basically what's going to be their budget, what kind of money they will be able to spend or something. Because whenever you see something, you constantly see if things are deliberately cheap, because they knew they won't be able to pour in that much money.
a failure to coordinate between tank units and anti-air units.
Okay, so how did the T-72 fare in combat? Well, during the Cold War, the Soviets were giving out T-72 tanks to everyone and anyone who wanted to get their hands on one of these. Their first use in combat was in the Lebanon War in 1982, and that's where they gained a great reputation. But it was really kind of the last time that we would speak highly of the vehicle. The reason why Russian tanks fell about 10 years behind Western tank technology around this time is because of the fall of the Soviet Union. During the 1990s, the US was focused on improving their tank armor and munitions, while the Russians were focused on trying to prevent total chaos in the wake of their collapse of their form of government. Production of their most modern tank ended in 1992.
Power vacuum is the most fucked up thing ever. So when collapse like that happen, yeah, your most problem is that make sure everything stays smooth going forward.
The last true
Which in a year or two there was
Soviet
like
tank design
tank fires in the city,
over
so
50 years ago with the T-72. But wait, there's still hope for the T-72. Between 1994 and 1996, during the first Chechen Wars, we got more data on how the T-72 performs in combat. There were 0 penetrations of T-72 frontal armor from man-portable anti-tank weapons. The bad news though, the Russians lost 44 T-72s from Chechen hunter-killer teams armed with RPGs. Analysis shows that between 3 and 6 RPG rounds are required to disable a T-72 from the rear, sides, or top of the tank. That's a lot of RPGs. In theory, the T-72 can penetrate Abrams in certain spots, like in the engine compartment and rear, but probably not the front or the sides. What could have been done in hindsight to fix the T-72, knowing what we know today? How could Russia have tailored their tank developments over the past 2 decades to improve its survivability? An emphasis should have been placed on heavier armor. The T-72 isn't large enough of a platform to support increased armor protection.
The problem is, I'm pretty sure they, at the time, they were like, they probably knew they wouldn't get the better engine for it. If they can get the engine for it, how are they going to make it bigger, more heavier? And if they still use their own old style of engine, they would be very slow. So that would be like problematic in itself. To me, it feels like it was easier to engineer this type of tank than the bigger and more powerful one.
Instead of relying on explosive reactive armor. More investment in active protection system technology would have improved survivability, but really a complete redesign of the T-72 from the ground up was what was required, because the autoloader keeping the shells in the turret, which if penetrated will cause a cook-off of the ammunition due to the design placement of ammo in the tank. These are fundamental design problems. Also, you gotta remember, the 50 cal machine gun has a weakness of requiring the commander to expose himself in order to fire it. Could the T-72 have performed much better if the Russian military corps...
So when you need a machine gun, which is like going to be much more close quarter situation, that's when the commander has to expose himself. So there you go. You're going to get shot.
Coordination was an amazing A+ fashion. I mean, what if they had achieved air superiority early in the war and they had communicated perfectly with other ground assets during their advance? Would we be having a much different discussion then? Would we be praising the T-72 instead? Thank you for watching Task and Purpose.
What does that mean? Military vehicles explain. Is it more like explain type of video? I need to watch that one. Yeah. So T-72 is like their most common tank. I'm guessing T-90s are like bigger and powerful, but it's like smaller in number, I guess, compared to this. I don't know. Probably something like that. So there you go. Yeah, people, why the Russian army T-72 tank is worse than you think? Communism. That's always the answer. Probably communism. This is my channel, Task and Purpose. If you like my reaction, don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.